Freedom is supposed to feel like relief. It's supposed to close wounds. It's supposed to quiet the past. It's supposed to mean the pain is over. But sometimes freedom arrives too late. When the doors finally opened, the world celebrated. Headlines declared victory. Fans cried with joy. People believed the story had reached its happy ending. But something felt off. Because freedom does not erase memory. It does not undo years of control, and it does not automatically give back what was taken while no one was looking. There are wounds that survive captivity, and Britney's pain did not disappear when the paperwork ended. What the public saw was a moment. What Britney lived through was a process. Years of being watched, years of being managed, years of having her voice questioned, redirected, rewritten. When you are controlled long enough, freedom can feel unfamiliar, even frightening. Silence becomes loud, choice becomes heavy, and the world expects gratitude before it allows healing. That is the part people don't understand. They think survival ends when control ends. They think freedom means repair. But what happens when the damage is internal? When autonomy was removed during the years it was supposed to form? When your identity learned to obey before it learned to choose? Britney didn't just lose control of her career, she lost ownership of her inner world. And when that kind of loss lasts for years, it doesn't vanish with applause. This story is not about victory. It is not about blame. It is not even about fame. It is about what freedom cannot fix on its own, and why the pain stayed long after the chains were gone. When the control ended, Britney was expected to transform instantly. From someone managed to someone healed, the world assumed that freedom was a switch, that once it was flipped, everything broken would simply reset itself. That expectation was never fair, because control does not only restrict movement, it reshapes the mind, it teaches dependence, it rewires instinct, and when it lasts long enough, it leaves behind habits that freedom alone cannot undo. For years, Britney's life operated on permission. Decisions were filtered, emotions were monitored, resistance was reframed as instability, compliance was rewarded as cooperation. Over time, that dynamic becomes internalized. You stop asking what you want and start asking what will be allowed. That is the most lasting damage of prolonged control. When autonomy is removed during adulthood, the mind adapts by minimizing risk. Choice begins to feel dangerous. Independence feels like exposure. Even joy can trigger anxiety, because joy without permission feels unfamiliar. This is why freedom often feels disorienting at first. Britney stepped out of a system that dictated her life and into a world that suddenly expected her to navigate everything alone. The same public that once scrutinized her obedience now scrutinized her recovery. Every action was read as a statement. Every silence was interpreted. Every emotion was dissected. Freedom did not come with privacy. Instead of being allowed to heal quietly, Britney was watched even more closely. Her expressions, her posts, her behavior, everything became evidence for someone else's theory. Some saw empowerment, others saw instability, few saw trauma working its way to the surface. Trauma does not leave politely. When control ends, suppressed emotion resurfaces. Anger that was never allowed to exist. Grief that had no space to be felt. Fear that was buried to survive. These emotions don't arrive in clean order. They overlap. They contradict each other. They confuse observers who expect composure instead of release. Britney was never given space to be messy. For years, she had been required to appear functional regardless of how she felt. That conditioning doesn't disappear with legal freedom. It lingers. It clashes with the sudden expectation that she should now self-regulate perfectly. That clash creates tension. Freedom introduces choice, but choice requires confidence. Confidence requires trust in one's own judgment. And Britney's judgment had been questioned, overridden, and dismissed for so long that trusting herself again was not automatic. This is where the pain stayed, not because freedom failed, but because freedom arrived without repair. Repair requires safety. Safety requires time. Time requires privacy. Britney received none of those. Instead, she entered a new phase of visibility, one where she was no longer controlled by a legal system, but was still confined by expectation. Fans wanted empowerment. Critics wanted proof of stability. Media wanted narrative. Everyone wanted something. Healing does not thrive under demand. Another consequence surfaced here: identity confusion. When someone else manages your life for years, your sense of self becomes fragmented. You know who you are expected to be, but not who you are when expectations are removed. That discovery process is slow, awkward, and often misunderstood. Britney's attempts to express herself freely were often read as erratic. But expression after long suppression rarely looks polished. It looks raw. It looks excessive. It looks like someone testing boundaries they were never allowed to have. That is not breakdown. That is recalibration. The problem is that recalibration is not linear. There are moments of clarity followed by confusion, moments of strength followed by exhaustion. From the outside, it looks inconsistent. From the inside, it is survival adjusting to new conditions. Britney's pain stayed because the world wanted a symbol, not a person. She became a symbol of liberation, of victory, of justice served. Symbols are not allowed to struggle. They are expected to represent resolution. But real people do not resolve on command. They process. Processing takes time, and it takes space free from judgment. Instead, Britney was placed back into a familiar role, being observed. Only now, instead of being managed by courts and conservators, she was managed by public interpretation. The control changed form, but it did not disappear. This is why freedom felt incomplete. The structures that once constrained her were gone, but the psychological imprint remained. Hypervigilance, mistrust, emotional flooding. These are not signs of weakness. They are predictable responses to prolonged control. Britney was not failing at freedom. She was learning how to live inside it. And learning after trauma is rarely graceful. The pain stayed because healing does not begin the moment control ends. It begins when the nervous system feels safe enough to relax. And for someone who spent years being monitored, evaluated, and overridden, safety does not arrive quickly. Freedom is a door. Healing is a long corridor beyond it. Britney had just stepped inside, and the world once again was watching instead of protecting. As Britney moved deeper into that corridor, the hardest realization began to surface. Freedom did not come with instructions. There was no guide for how to live after years of being told when to speak, where to go, what to feel, and how to behave. The structure that once confined her had also, paradoxically, organized her world. When it vanished, the emptiness it left behind was overwhelming. Control had given her a script. Freedom demanded improvisation. And improvisation is terrifying when your instincts were trained out of you. For years, Britney's safety depended on predictability. Routines were enforced. Choices were minimized. Risk was managed externally. Over time, her nervous system learned that deviation was dangerous. That autonomy led to punishment. That expressing the wrong emotion could be used against her. Those lessons do not disappear when legal authority ends. They live in the body. So even simple decisions carried weight. What to post, where to go, who to trust. Each choice came with invisible consequences shaped by memory. Freedom asked her to rely on internal signals that had been systematically dismissed for years. That internal conflict became exhausting. This is where people misread her most. They saw someone free behaving in ways that didn't align with their expectations of recovery. They expected composure, clarity, restraint. What they saw instead was intensity, rawness, emotional overflow. But overflow is not instability, it is release. When expression has been suppressed for too long, it does not return gently. It arrives all at once. Emotions that were postponed demand attention simultaneously. Joy, rage, grief, relief, fear, they do not cue politely. They collide. Britney was processing years in real time. Another layer of pain surfaced here. Betrayal, not just by individuals, but by systems, by institutions meant to protect, by professionals who framed control as care, by a public that watched and accepted explanations that reduced her humanity to headlines. That betrayal complicates healing, because healing requires trust. And trust is difficult when the very structures that claim to act in your best interest became sources of harm. It becomes hard to distinguish support from supervision, help from control, concern from intrusion. Britney's suspicion was not paranoia, it was learned. She had been taught repeatedly that her voice could be overridden, her perspective dismissed, her distress reinterpreted as pathology. Regaining confidence in her own perception was not automatic. It required unlearning survival strategies that once kept her compliant. This is where anger often appears. Anger at lost years, anger at stolen agency. Anger at being told to be grateful for survival instead of acknowledged for harm. Anger is uncomfortable for observers. It disrupts the redemption narrative. People prefer gratitude. They want closure. They want the survivor to smile and move on so they can feel good about supporting them. But anger is a necessary stage of recovery. It signals recognition. Recognition that what happened was wrong. Recognition that pain was justified. Recognition that healing does not require politeness. Britney's anger was often mislabeled as instability because society is uncomfortable when women express rage, especially women who were once packaged as harmless, obedient, and consumable. Her resistance broke the image people were attached to, and breaking that image came at a cost. Public sympathy began to fracture. Support turned conditional. Praise came only when her behavior aligned with expectations. When it didn't, concern quickly morphed into judgment. This conditional support mirrored the very dynamics she was trying to escape. Freedom without unconditional safety is incomplete. Another challenge emerged: loneliness. Not the absence of people, but the absence of safe connection. When trust has been damaged, closeness feels risky. Every relationship carries the question, are you here for me or for access? That question does not fade easily. Britney's world had taught her that closeness often came with control, that love was intertwined with supervision, that dependence could be weaponized. Untangling those associations takes time and repetition in safe contexts, something she rarely received. Instead, her life remained public. Every attempt to rebuild was observed, every boundary tested, every expression interpreted. Even freedom itself became content. People analyzed her posts not as communication, but as evidence. Evidence of healing, evidence of decline, evidence of whatever narrative they preferred. This constant evaluation kept her nervous system activated. Healing requires a sense of being unseen, not ignored, but unjudged. Britney never got that. She moved from one form of surveillance to another. The watchers changed, but the gaze remained. This is why the pain stayed. Not because freedom failed, but because freedom arrived without sanctuary. The conservatorship ended, but the environment that enabled it never fully disappeared. The same culture that once accepted her control now scrutinized her autonomy. The same fascination that justified intervention now justified intrusion. Britney was expected to prove she deserved freedom. That expectation is itself a wound. You do not heal by performing wellness. You heal by being allowed to be unwell without consequence. Britney was rarely given that permission. This second phase of her life was not about reclaiming fame or rebuilding a career. It was about learning how to exist without being managed, about testing boundaries, about making mistakes without losing everything. Those are experiences most people have earlier in life, quietly, without witnesses. Britney was having them later, loudly, under a microscope, and the world confused that noise for failure. In reality, it was adjustment. Adjustment after prolonged control is not graceful. It is uneven. It includes regression and progress at the same time. It includes moments of strength followed by vulnerability. It includes behaviors that look excessive because moderation was never allowed before. Britney was not stuck in pain. She was moving through it. But movement takes time, and time, once again, was something the world seemed unwilling to give her. This is where the story deepens, not toward resolution, but toward understanding. Because what comes next is not about law or freedom, but about the long-term psychological cost of living under control, and what it truly takes to rebuild a sense of self after it has been overridden for years. As Britney continued trying to rebuild herself, a deeper problem surfaced. one that freedom alone could not solve. Her sense of self had been interrupted for so long that it no longer felt continuous. It felt fragmented, like pieces of identity formed at different times, under different rules, never fully integrating. This is what prolonged control does that people rarely talk about. It doesn't just limit action, it disrupts development. Large parts of Britney's adult life were lived in compliance rather than choice. Decisions were made for her, justified as protection. Over time, the skill of self-direction weakened, not because she lacked intelligence or instinct, but because those instincts were never allowed to be trusted. When that happens, autonomy feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. Freedom suddenly demanded something she hadn't been allowed to practice: self-authorship. Deciding who she was, not who she was permitted to be. That process is destabilizing when it happens late and publicly. It requires experimentation, contradiction, and mistakes. And mistakes, for Britney, had always carried consequences far beyond what was reasonable. This created a constant internal tension. On one side, the desire to finally live authentically. On the other, the fear that authenticity would once again be used against her. That fear did not disappear with legal independence. It lingered as hypervigilance, as second-guessing, as emotional swings that looked confusing to outsiders but made sense inside a nervous system trained for threat. Britney's behavior during this period was often interpreted through a simplistic lens. Either she was finally free or she was still unwell. That binary erased the complexity of recovery. Healing does not move in straight lines, it moves in spirals. You revisit the same emotions at deeper levels. You gain insight and then feel overwhelmed again. Progress and struggle coexist. What made this especially hard for Britney was the absence of a private learning space. Most people are allowed to figure themselves out quietly. They make poor decisions, reflect, adjust, and grow without their missteps becoming permanent records. Britney had no such margin for error. Every action was amplified. Every mood was interpreted as diagnosis. Every expression was archived. This level of exposure keeps the nervous system activated. Safety is not just physical. It is psychological. It is the sense that you can exist without being evaluated. Britney had not experienced that in decades, so even after freedom, her body remained in a state of readiness, as if control could return at any moment. This is why the pain persisted. Trauma is not stored in memory alone. It is stored in reflex, in posture, in emotional response, in how quickly fear appears when boundaries are crossed. Freedom does not automatically reset those patterns. It merely removes the immediate threat. The work that follows is internal, slow, and often invisible. Another loss became clearer here: trust in reality itself. When your experiences are repeatedly dismissed or reframed by authority, you begin questioning your own perception. Was it really that bad? Am I overreacting? Do I remember correctly? This erosion of self-trust is devastating because it leaves a person vulnerable to doubt even when their feelings are valid. Rebuilding self-trust takes repetition. You have to act on your instincts and see that nothing terrible happens. You have to say no and survive the guilt. You have to feel anger without punishment. Britney was attempting all of this under observation, where every test felt risky. That pressure distorted the process. Her expressions became more intense, not because she was losing control, but because subtlety had never protected her. When mild protest was ignored for years, strong expression feels like the only language left. This is where people misunderstood her most. They saw intensity and assumed instability. They saw repetition and assumed obsession. They saw vulnerability and assumed weakness. In reality, they were watching someone relearn how to exist as a self rather than a subject. Another painful realization emerged here. Freedom did not restore lost time. The years under control were gone. Experiences that shape adulthood, independence, exploration, self-definition, had been delayed or denied. Grief for that loss surfaced unpredictably, sometimes as sadness, sometimes as anger, sometimes as behavior that looked regressive but was actually delayed development finally expressing itself. Grief like that does not resolve cleanly. It does not respond to encouragement or celebration. It requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was something Britney rarely received. The world wanted to move forward. She was still processing what had happened. This created a mismatch. Public timelines demanded closure. Her internal timeline demanded patience. That mismatch kept her in pain. Another factor deepened it. The question of agency in relationships. When control has been exerted through closeness, family, caregivers, professionals, intimacy becomes complicated. Trust is entangled with fear. Dependency feels dangerous. Independence feels lonely. Britney had to renegotiate what connection meant to her, who could be trusted, who respected boundaries, who was present without agenda. That process involves trial and error was never safe for her. Every misjudgment was magnified. And yet, avoiding connection altogether was not an option. Isolation carries its own harm. So she moved cautiously, inconsistently, learning through experience what safety felt like, often in public view. This phase of her life was not about reclaiming a crown or proving resilience. It was about rebuilding a nervous system that had been trained to submit, about reconnecting thought and feeling after years of dissociation, about learning that autonomy does not require perfection. Britney was not broken by freedom. She was overwhelmed by the work freedom demands after prolonged control, and that work does not come with applause. It does not look graceful. It does not resolve quickly, but it is necessary. This is why the pain stayed, not as a failure of liberation, but as evidence of how deep the damage went. Freedom opened the door, but healing required her to walk through rooms she had been locked out of for years. And some of those rooms were dark, unfamiliar, and frightening. That is where she was now. As Britney moved through this phase, another weight settled in. One that was less obvious, but just as heavy as legal control. Expectation. Not expectation from courts or lawyers this time, but from the public itself. Freedom had turned her into a symbol, and symbols are not allowed to struggle. The moment the conservatorship ended, a new narrative replaced the old one. Britney was no longer controlled. She was saved. And once someone is saved in the public imagination, they are expected to perform recovery on schedule. Strength is demanded immediately. Gratitude is assumed. Pain becomes inconvenient. This created a new kind of pressure. Britney was expected to look healed before she had time to heal, to act stable before stability had a chance to form, to represent victory while she was still learning how to live inside her own choices. That contradiction was suffocating. Every expression she shared was filtered through expectation. If she appeared joyful, it was celebrated as proof that freedom worked. If she appeared distressed, it was questioned as evidence that something was still wrong with her. There was no neutral ground, no room to simply exist without meaning being assigned. This is how visibility becomes another form of control. Not imposed by law, but by interpretation. Britney's attempts to express herself through movement, words, repetition were often read as signs rather than communications. People stopped asking what she was trying to say and started asking what her behavior meant. That subtle shift stripped her of agency again. She was no longer speaking. She was being analyzed. This kind of attention keeps the nervous system on edge. It teaches vigilance. It reinforces the belief that safety is conditional, that one wrong expression could once again justify intervention, judgment, or loss of autonomy. For someone whose freedom had already been taken once, that fear is not irrational. So even in freedom, Britney remained braced. Another layer of pain surfaced here. Loneliness inside visibility. Millions watched her. Millions spoke about her. But very few listened without agenda. Support often came with expectations. Concern came with conditions. Empathy came only when she behaved acceptably. This mirrors the original harm. Control justified as care. Surveillance framed as concern. Compliance rewarded as wellness. The structure changed, but the emotional pattern felt familiar. Britney was once again navigating an environment where deviation felt risky, where expressing anger made people uncomfortable, where sadness was tolerated only briefly, where complexity was flattened into judgments. And complexity was exactly what her healing required. Real recovery involves contradiction, feeling strong and broken at the same time, wanting independence while craving safety, trusting yourself one day and doubting everything the next. These states are normal after prolonged trauma, but they are rarely allowed in public figures. Britney's recovery was happening under a spotlight that demanded coherence when incoherence was part of the process. That mismatch kept reopening wounds. Instead of being allowed to integrate her experience privately, she had to defend it indirectly. Through posts, through silence, through behavior that outsiders interpreted without context. The pressure to appear okay became another burden layered onto unresolved trauma. This is why the pain did not fade with freedom, because healing requires containment, a space where emotions can rise and fall without consequence, a place where identity can be tested without punishment. Britney never fully received that space. Her freedom existed legally, but not psychologically. And until the mind believes it is safe from evaluation, from override, from judgment, it cannot fully relax. It cannot fully trust. It cannot fully heal. This is the paradox of her story. The world celebrated the end of her confinement, but the environment that made confinement possible remained largely unchanged. She was free, but still watched. Autonomous, but still interpreted. Alive, but still performing. This is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable truth. Freedom is not just the absence of control. It is the presence of safety. And safety, for Britney, was still fragile. In the end, Britney Spears' story is not a simple victory over control. It is a lesson in what control leaves behind. Freedom arrived. The pain stayed. And that contradiction confused people who wanted an ending instead of a process. What Britney endured did not stop when the conservatorship ended, because the most powerful effects of long-term control are not legal. They are psychological. They live in the nervous system, in instinct, in how safe a person feels making choices without permission. Freedom removed the cage. It did not remove the imprint of the cage. Years of being managed taught Britney to doubt herself, to brace for correction, to expect her reality to be questioned. That kind of conditioning does not disappear when authority steps away. It fades only when safety replaces surveillance, and safety was something she rarely received. The public wanted closure. Healing demanded patience. Those two things collided. Britney became a symbol of liberation before she was allowed to be a human in recovery. She was celebrated but not protected, watched but not held, encouraged but not given space to struggle without consequence. And so the pain remained, not as failure, but as evidence. Evidence of how deeply control reaches, evidence of how trauma survives applause, evidence of how freedom without sanctuary can feel overwhelming instead of healing. Britney did not need to prove she deserved freedom. She needed time to learn how to live inside it. Her story asks a difficult question, one that goes beyond fame, courts, or headlines. What happens to a person when their autonomy is removed during the years it is supposed to solidify? And more importantly, what responsibility does society carry after that autonomy is returned? Because Britney is not an exception. She is a warning. A warning that survival is not the same as recovery, that liberation is not the same as repair, and that public victories do not erase private damage. Her pain stayed because healing was never meant to be performed. It was meant to be protected. If this story changed how you see Britney Spears, not as a headline, not as a symbol, but as a human being learning to exist after prolonged control, then it has done its job. And if it made you question how society treats those it claims to save, that matters even more. For more long-form documentaries that go beyond noise and explore the psychology behind fame, control, trauma, and recovery, stay with this channel. Subscribe for stories that value depth over spectacle, turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, and share this video with someone who still believes freedom automatically fixes everything, because sometimes the hardest part of being free is learning how to feel safe again.